My parents insisted I apologize to keep the peace until I showed everyone what peace looked like without their rules controlling me. I am a 32-year-old woman, and for most of my life, my family used the word peace in a very specific way. It meant keeping quiet, looking calm, and pretending nothing uncomfortable had happened. Whenever something went wrong, eyes shifted toward me as if I had been chosen to make everything smooth again. I learned the pattern so early that I barely noticed it anymore, at least until the dinner that finally showed me how far it had gone. The evening started like a normal family gathering. The table was set, the kids moved around the living room, and everyone carried the usual polite smiles. It stayed that way until Madison, my brother Evan's wife, brought up an Easter memory out of nowhere. She described a moment where she claimed I raised my voice at her because a dish went missing from the counter. She told it like a funny mix-up, adding small details that made it sound like I had been dramatic over something simple. As soon as she finished, my parents exchanged a familiar look. It was the same look they used whenever they expected me to take control of a situation, even if I had not caused it. Evan leaned back and let her continue, not correcting anything. I told her the event never happened, but she smiled through it and adjusted her story as if she were simply remembering it differently. My mother leaned closer and lowered her voice, telling me to let it go because gatherings were not the place for arguments. My father shifted in his chair the same way he always did when moments grew tense. The table went quiet and the kids glanced between adults like they knew this rhythm better than they should. I excused myself to step away from the table for a moment. The room fell still, almost like people were afraid to move until I returned. My mother followed me into the hallway and asked me to go back and smooth things over, especially since guests were around. She explained Madison was sensitive and that acknowledging a misunderstanding, even if one did not exist, would help keep the evening peaceful. I asked her why accuracy mattered less than protecting someone who had just made something up. She gave the same line I had heard my whole life. The simplest path was to avoid conflict. The message beneath it was the same as always. Peace worked only if I carried it. When I returned to the table, everyone waited for me to take my usual role. They expected me to apologize or lighten the mood or redirect the room. Instead, I sat quietly and let the evening continue without stepping in. The shift threw the atmosphere off balance, not because of anything dramatic, but because the routine they relied on suddenly wasn't there. Later that night, driving home, I replayed the moments in order. Madison's story, my parents' looks, the hallway conversation, the silence at the table. For the first time, it all formed a clear picture. My family's version of peace only existed when I absorbed the discomfort they wanted to avoid. And for the first time in my life, I started to wonder why that responsibility had ever belonged to me at all. A week after that dinner, my mother called and asked me to stop by the house. She mentioned wanting to clear the air, which usually meant they wanted things back on the track they preferred. When I arrived, the dining table was covered with papers. At first, I thought they were sorting old mail, but then I noticed the writing, seating charts, notes, highlighted sections. They were planning their upcoming anniversary dinner like it was a formal event. My mother pointed to one of the charts where my name was written next to Madison's. She explained that it would keep things pleasant. My father looked over the layout and nodded in agreement, acting like the matter had already been settled. My mother then mentioned the Easter story again, this time saying it would be best for everyone if I brought it up gently during the dinner and helped smooth out the confusion. I reminded them the story never happened, but my father waved off the point as if the accuracy did not matter. He mentioned that tone was more important than details. That line had been used in my childhood so many times that it blended with the wallpaper in that house. He said the evening needed to run smoothly and that guests should not sense tension. I asked whether anyone had spoken to Madison or Evan about their part in the situation. Both parents paused. My mother pressed her lips together and adjusted a placemat that did not need adjusting. My father commented that bringing them into it would shift the focus. When I asked what focus he meant, he avoided the question. Then my mother admitted they had already told Madison that I would address the misunderstanding during the dinner. That explained why Madison had looked so confident at the previous gathering. She had been told I would take responsibility for something I did not do. The realization settled over the room like furniture being moved into place. My parents waited for me to follow the script they had prepared, the same one I had followed for years. I told them plainly that I would not apologize for something that never happened. My mother looked startled and asked what she should tell Madison now. My father muttered that I was choosing difficulty over unity. I stood near the table looking at the seating charts and notes they had written. Every single sheet had something about tone, flow, or keeping things calm. None of them mentioned fairness or accuracy. It became obvious how much work they put into shaping events to avoid any disruption as long as I absorbed whatever discomfort came with it. I asked them what peace meant to them. My mother said it was when gatherings stayed light and no one argued. My father agreed and added that people should not make scenes. When I asked how peace worked when only one person was expected to maintain it, they both grew quiet. I left the house without raising my voice and without agreeing to anything. As I stepped outside, the seating charts remained scattered across the table behind me, all designed around a version of harmony that only existed if I played the part they assigned, and for the first time, I chose not to play it. The anniversary dinner took place the following weekend, and from the moment I walked through the door, it was clear everyone had been briefed. The room went quiet for a second before people resumed their conversations. My mother hovered close, guiding me toward my seat, as if placing me in the right spot would control the outcome of the night. The chair beside me was empty, waiting for Madison. Evan and Madison arrived a few minutes later. Madison walked in with the same rehearsed smile she had used at the last gathering. She sat down beside me with an expectant posture, almost like she was waiting for a cue. My parents kept glancing toward the two of us, watching for the moment they assumed was coming. Dinner began, normally enough. Plates were passed, small conversations filled the table, and everyone tried to act relaxed. But every few minutes, someone's eyes drifted in my direction, checking if I would start the clearing the air moment they had been promised. Halfway through the meal, Madison brought up the Easter story again, adjusting details as if she was fine-tuning a memory. A few relatives chuckled automatically, the way people do when they sense they should be amused. My parents looked at me with quiet anticipation. Instead of playing along, I simply corrected the record. I stated that the event had never happened and that I did not plan to revisit it further. The table paused. Madison waited for me to soften my words or offer some excuse to ease the tension. When nothing followed, a long silence settled. Evan shifted in his chair, pretending to focus on his meal. My father cleared his throat and gave one of his familiar reminders about keeping harmony. I stayed steady, mentioning that harmony could not exist if stories were allowed to be rewritten whenever someone wanted attention. My mother placed her hand on the table as if signaling for me to stop, but I kept my voice even and simple. A few relatives had their eyes fixed on us, watching the exchange without interrupting. The conversation around the table slowed until people stopped trying to pretend it was casual. I explained that I would no longer take responsibility for smoothing out moments built on false claims. The words were plain, not dramatic, but they landed in a way the room could not ignore. Madison reacted with surprise and confusion, like she had not expected any outcome other than the routine she was used to. She asked why I was making things tense, but her voice lacked the confidence she'd had earlier. Evan leaned back, unsure how to step in now that the script had fallen apart. My parents exchanged another one of their silent looks, but this time it didn't create the reaction they wanted. The relatives who watched began turning their attention away, sensing the usual structure had broken. For the rest of the dinner, the atmosphere stayed strangely calm. Not peaceful in the way my parents defined it, just honest. People spoke in smaller groups. No one waited for me to reset the room. No one pushed the conversation back toward the Easter story. When dessert was served, the tension had dissolved. Not because I had fixed it, but because I refused to carry it. And that shift changed the entire direction of the evening. 2 days after the anniversary dinner, I found out through a group message that my parents had hosted a brunch for several relatives. Photos were shared of the table, the food, the kids running around. My name was not mentioned anywhere, and no invitation had been sent. The timing made the intention clear. That evening, my father showed up at my door without calling first. He stood straight, almost formal, like he had planned every part of the visit. He began talking about how gatherings could spiral when emotions ran high. He kept his voice steady, trying to present the dinner as something that had simply gotten away from everyone. He hinted that I had caused tension, but when I asked him what part he meant, he paused. He avoided responding to that and instead asked me to attend a future gathering to clear the air. He couldn't explain what air needed clearing, which told me everything. The next morning, messages began arriving from relatives. One mentioned hearing that I had been overwhelmed at the dinner. Another asked if I was doing better. When my aunt reached out, she mentioned hearing that Madison had tried to calm me down during the dinner. That alone showed how far the news story had spread. I explained the exact events without adding anything extra. She grew quiet and said the version she had heard did not match mine at all. Throughout the day, more relatives contacted me with their own versions. Some were mild, some were exaggerated, but all of them painted me as the center of the problem. Every detail pointed back to someone shaping a narrative. After the dinner, he hinted that Madison was stressed because people thought she was involved in drama. When I asked him what part of the dinner he believed had been inappropriate, he hesitated. He tried again to redirect the conversation, but each time I asked for an example, he stalled. The silence that followed told me what I needed to know. The discomfort had existed long before I pushed back. All I had done was stop absorbing it. By the end of the day, it was clear my family wasn't dealing with conflict. They were dealing with the absence of the person who usually concealed it, and without that cover, everything they tried to hide was starting to show. She mentioned hearing different versions of the anniversary dinner and wanted to sort out what actually happened. We met at a small cafe near her office. She sat down with a notebook, something she often carried for work, and asked me to walk her through the evening from start to finish. I described only the actions in the sequence, nothing more. As she listened, she began connecting the pattern to earlier moments she had witnessed. She brought up a holiday gathering from 2 years ago, where a small mix-up had turned into a quiet expectation that I would smooth things over. She had never questioned it at the time, but now it looked different to her. Later that day, she spoke with two cousins who had been at the anniversary dinner. Both said Madison looked ready for a conversation before I even arrived, mentioning her, tapping her fork, checking the doorway repeatedly, and straightening her posture whenever someone mentioned my name. Those details spread quickly through the family. Word reached my parents that relatives were discussing everything among themselves. That alone caused movement. My parents began making private phone calls to relatives, telling them the situation had been exaggerated and that everyone should avoid adding fuel to unnecessary tension. They tried to give the impression that the dinner had gone normally and that someone was misunderstanding the events. Meanwhile, Madison tried a separate approach. She contacted a few relatives, claiming that I had been distant for weeks and that the dinner tension came from built-up stress. She also suggested that I had taken her Easter story too personally. The stories she circulated didn't match each other, which made them collapse quickly when people compared notes. I kept my routine unchanged. I went to work, handled errands, and avoided any role in correcting or guiding conversations. The absence of my involvement seemed to draw even more attention than anything I had done at the dinner. Each asked what was happening, but instead of gossiping, they wanted clarity. Another pointed out that no one confronted Madison directly, which surprised them. They were no longer focused on my reaction, but on why I had always been the one expected to absorb tension. People brought up old examples, small instances from past gatherings where I had been nudged into cleaning up situations I didn't cause. By the end of the weekend, my parents attempted something new. Saying they didn't want to be part of a discussion that repeated old patterns. The response caught my parents off guard. For the first time, they couldn't control the storyline, and the version they had relied on for years no longer held. A few days after the failed family reset, my mother called and invited me to Sunday dinner. Her wording was careful, almost rehearsed. She mentioned wanting the family to move forward and said the evening would be calm. I agreed to go, not because I expected anything different, but because I wanted to make my boundaries clear in a setting where they could not be avoided. When I arrived, the dining room looked unusually formal. The table was set with cloth napkins, polished silverware, and placemats I had not seen since holiday dinners. My parents stood near the table as if waiting for a meeting to start. Van and Madison were already seated, both watching me closely. My mother opened the evening by talking about how difficult the past few weeks had been for everyone. She mentioned misunderstandings without assigning specifics and suggested the family should return to its usual atmosphere. The tone of the room shifted as she spoke, signaling that they expected me to reset everything. My father added that disagreements should not overshadow family unity. He spoke calmly, but his words pointed to the idea that both sides had contributed equally to the tension. Madison sat up straighter, her expression tight but composed, as if she believed the conversation would end in her favor. When it was my turn to speak, I stayed focused on facts. I explained that the past few weeks had shown me how much responsibility I had carried for events I did not create. I described how gatherings often relied on me to keep the tone steady, even when others caused the disruption. I kept my voice even, describing actions rather than emotions. My father attempted to guide the conversation back toward forgiveness, but I didn't follow the direction he aimed for. Instead, I talked about the difference between resolving tension and absorbing it. My mother's face tightened slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. She was not used to direct explanations that did not fold into her plans. I clarified that I was not separating myself from the family. I simply would not take on roles I had never agreed to. Evan leaned forward, asking if that meant I would miss future gatherings. I explained that I would attend any gathering where expectations were shared and not placed only on one person. The room shifted again. Madison's disbelief was visible. She asked why the issue had become so large, but the question fell flat. No one immediately supported her. Like before, my mother tried to salvage the evening by offering new plans for upcoming gatherings. She mentioned adjusting seating, arranging activities, and simplifying dinners. I listened but didn't commit to anything. The conversation no longer moved according to the script she had prepared. I finished by explaining that peace built on one person's silence was not peace. It was pressure, and I would no longer participate in that version of family life. The air in the room grew still, not tense, just unfamiliar. For years, my actions had shaped the atmosphere. Now the room had to settle without leaning on me. The dinner ended quietly, Plates were cleared, chairs pushed in, and no one tried to pull me aside for a private talk. For the first time, the evening ended without anyone expecting me to carry it. The week after, the Sunday dinner moved in a way I had not seen before. No sudden calls, no detailed plans disguised as check-ins, no relatives passing along concerns. The quiet felt unusual only because my family had never left space for it before. Midweek, my aunt invited me on a day trip to a botanical garden outside the city. She mentioned wanting company that did not involve solving tension. We spent the morning walking through long paths lined with bright flowers. She pointed out how different recent gatherings had felt, noting how people spoke more freely when no one tried to direct the tone of the room. It was the first time someone described a family event without linking my presence to responsibility. Later that evening, a cousin sent me a message about a small dinner Evan and Madison had hosted. They planned it, hoping to rebuild the impression that they were the calm center of the family. Only a few people attended, and the ones who did said the dinner felt awkward without the usual pressure placed on me. Natural disagreements surfaced, and the couple struggled to handle them. The tension that usually landed on my shoulders landed everywhere else. Around the same time, my parents invited two relatives for lunch. They intended to explain the recent confusion, but the relatives asked direct questions they were not used to answering. My parents repeated their usual lines about misunderstandings, but the relatives pushed back, asking for specifics. My parents left the luncheon settled, realizing the usual storyline was no longer working. Toward the end of the week, my mother contacted me asking to meet. Instead of going to their house, I suggested a small cafe near my apartment. Meeting somewhere neutral kept the conversation from slipping into old habits. She arrived early and sat with her hands folded on the table. She started with uncertainty, mentioning she did not know where she stood with me anymore. She explained that the recent shifts in the family made her wonder if I still wanted her involved in my life. I kept my response simple and focused on what had changed. Conversations could no longer rely on one person adjusting themselves to make everyone else comfortable. She listened without interrupting. When I explained how often I had been expected to hold tension that belonged to other people, she lowered her eyes for a long moment. She admitted she had not seen how automatic those expectations had become. The words came slowly, as if she was hearing them for the first time. I laid out what future gatherings would look like for me. Shared responsibility, clear expectations, no preset roles. She nodded, still taking in what the new structure meant. There was no argument, no attempt to redirect the conversation, just a quiet understanding forming in front of us. Over the next month, gatherings became smaller. People talked openly without watching for cues. Tension surfaced and settled naturally. No one waited for me to reset the room. For the first time, peace did not depend on me creating it. It existed because everyone carried a part of it themselves.